Thank you very much, Jan. Well, that takes care of the introductions, I guess. So I guess we can get into it immediately. First of all, thank you again to both of you for coming. It's an amazing opportunity to have such two veterans of the Liberty Movement here at the Top Leadership Retreat. Both of you have sort of connecting careers. I spoke with Mayo yesterday, and it turns out that Dr. Tom Palmer had quite a bit of influence in getting you where you are today. And you, of course, Dr. Palmer, have spent years working with both Students for Liberty, some of our alumni, as well as other pro-liberty students across the world. I want to start off with Mayo and sort of bringing it back to SFL with discussing sort of the beginnings of SFL Africa and the experience of you and a small team of people running around the continent with a bunch of books, trying to influence students, trying to build an organization.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's my first time here, first time at a European retreat, and that's surprising because I should have come here many years ago. I think it's very important that we're having these conversations about promoting liberty in spaces outside of Europe with a European audience. And the same thing is happening on other continents as well, because it gets to create an avenue for us to hear how other people in other places are promoting liberty. We share, we all belong to the same organization and we share the same values of liberty. And our fights for the ideas of liberty might differ. The kind of conversations that we're having might differ. The topics or the challenges that we're facing in our respective regions might differ. But one thing that is constant is our love for individual and economic freedom around the world, for ourselves and for everyone that lives around us. It's a very interesting story. So first, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Palmer for a lot of support. When we started African Students for Liberty, I don't think that the organization would have been as successful as it is today if it wasn't for Dr. Palmer's push and his efforts in connecting individuals. Yesterday we spoke about connecting individuals and how it's important to be the one who introduces people to one another. Dr. Palmer had introduced me to, I'm not sure if you remember, but you introduced me to Makobin and to Students for Liberty. And while we had our own efforts, like in Africa, then it was called the African Liberty Students Organization, we were actively trying to reach out to other students. It was myself and a crop of friends and a group of friends that had found the ideas of liberty. I had found Bastiat. And I thought that Bastiat's arguments for the ideas of liberty were very profound. They were easy to understand. They were simple. They got me thinking about the state of my country, Nigeria. And for those who know, Nigeria had come out of a military dictatorship in 1999, but we still had relics of that dictatorship. And it was very troubling. The police was very brutal. And I, as an undergraduate, I was very curious about why my country was the way it was. And I had tried to explore, find answers, and I'd explored other ways to find those answers. I was involved with Model United Nations. I was trying to study economics, even though my first degree was in animal physiology, so I was trained to be a vet. But I knew that these questions, I needed answers to them. And Bastiat seemed to explain, in the Candlemakers petition, he explained a lot of what is in and what is not. And those opened my eyes. And a few of my friends also found the same ideas through Atlas Network's efforts on the continent, because Atlas was giving books and giving CDs and introducing young people to the ideas of liberty. And that's how I found out about liberty. And we immediately started groups across the continent. So first we started in Nigeria, in my school, and then very quickly we started establishing groups, identifying other people. Friends would connect us to other people, other young people across the continent, and then they would encourage them to start groups. And before we knew it, we had groups across the continent of Africa. The introduction that Tom did to the Students for Liberty Network, to Makobin and Sloan, led to an integrated effort. What we were doing in Africa, because a lot of young people were doing the same thing in Europe.
Yep.
There was Fred doing that in Europe, and Wolf, and in Brazil, young people who thought about this, who had similar challenges as well, were doing the same thing. And it just made sense for us to connect. And I think that's one of the beauties of Students for Liberty, is that international network. That whether I'm in Austria, or I'm in South Africa, or I'm in Nigeria, I can find somebody who shares the same ideas, who shares the same values. And like I said, the challenges might be different, but the love for liberty is the same. And I'm intensely profound to the connection that Tom did, and to being part of Students for Liberty.
Speaking of that connection and sort of the interactions you have with SFLers everywhere, I wanted to ask Tom, you've been connected with Students for Liberty now for well over a decade. What has been your general experience interacting with SFLers, with local coordinators across the world, and what is it that that keeps making you come back to influencing young students and young activists in the Liberty movement?
I knew the founders before they founded it, and they had clubs at their various universities, and I had spoken to them, and then I was so impressed that they said, let's do an organization ourselves. Let's go do that. And didn't go and ask someone for lots of money and so on. They said, we're just going to do that. And did it on their own budget. And the first conference at Columbia, the new Alexander McCoben and Sloan and some others from University of Pennsylvania and University of Chicago. And they invited me to come up to their conference at Columbia University. And I called a friend, Donald Smith, and Donald was a self-made centimillionaire. He's a very wealthy person, grew up poor on a farm, and is a very flinty businessman. You make money by cutting costs, how to do more with less. And I said, you want to come to this conference? A group of really very fine young people. And he said, yeah, sure. So it was on Saturday, and he showed up wearing sweatpants and just jogging clothes. It just looked like some guy, right? And not someone who was really wealthy and astonishingly accomplished. And he listened, and I didn't introduce him as, this is my extremely wealthy friend, just a guy who came with me. And afterward he said, I like this group. I like what they had to say, I liked what they did, and I liked how cheap they are. They had off-brand cola product. It wasn't Coca-Cola, it was, Bob's discount cola product. Very cheap, and cheap pizza. So they don't piss away money. And I said, well, that's good to know. And I talked to Alexander, I said, ask Don for money. And why don't you pitch doing this across the country? Do it in Seattle and do it in, far-flung exotic places like Toronto and foreign countries. And he did, and pitched them for $75,000 to run a whole series of conferences. Don said, okay, I'll do it. And then Alexander frantically called me up after they were all done. He said, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, we didn't spend all the money. We only spent $67,000. I said, let me explain the world to you. This is not a problem. This is a good thing. Write to Don and say, we didn't spend all your money. Thank you so much. Here's a report. What happened? We had 140 kids at this place and 119 at that one. And write back and say, we have extra money left over. We can send it back if you would like. Let me know what you want. Obviously, he said, that's great, do more, and sent another check. But the willingness to do those hard things cheaply and not, pardon my French, as they say in North America, not piss away other people's resources. And that is something I respect. And people who create wealth respect that as well. So that's one thing I like. The other thing I like is the corporate culture, which was a deliberate process of the SFL leaders. It's so easy in this world to hate other people. There's lots of hate in the world. You disagree with someone, that person's a bad person, and you should hate them and mock them and so on. And typically that's how our competitors treat us, right? They don't like us, and often they hate us and they demonize us. They immediately assume bad motives for the views that we uphold. And SFL said from the very beginning, we're not going to do that. We assume other people who disagree with us have good motives. We think that their arguments may be lacking, and we're going to engage with them, but we don't have any enemies. I love that, and the reason is their psychological profile to advocates of liberty and advocates of collectivism. If you start out hating other people because they're wrong, or even they support really unjust things, if you hate them, you're on the road to collectivism, because hatred leads to collectivism, the enemy. And if you think about the great liberal thinkers, they haven't had that attitude. Hayek comes to mind, and now my brain is failing me, but the second Nobel laureate to die in prison from China, someone help me with his name, great, great man, read his Nobel speech, I have no enemies. And he said, enemy mentality poisons liberty. It's destructive, and I think that's right. And I really like the SFL approach, which is to stress reaching out and winning friends rather than hurting people and hating them and so on. Leave that to the collectivists. We need to be better than that, and SFL has risen to that challenge.
Thank you very much. This is sort of a question for both of you. We were talking about activists and people who died in prison. I think both of you have had during your careers near-death experiences or situations where your lives were threatened, and then indirectly both of you worked on getting people out of prison, getting people out of authoritarian countries, getting people who were on blacklists and death lists. Can you talk about those sort of experiences and those stories, and what was the thing that compelled you to help those people out and get them to safety?
Thanks. So I think we've had, one that comes to mind is a situation that we had in the Gambia. I think that was around 2015. So we had these very brave coordinators in the Gambia. For those who are a bit familiar with the history of the Gambia, they had this president called Yahya Jammeh, who was very autocratic, who made people disappear when they disagreed with him. And he wasn't a very big fan of Students for Liberty and the activists that were very vocal about the tyrannical, they didn't want to live under a tyrannical government. And two gentlemen, Aliou Bangura, who was a regional coordinator at the time, and Ibrahima Sisi, were very vocal about the situation in the Gambia and did not want to have they didn't want to live under that kind of a regime. Both of them had been arrested a few times, and there was some sort of revolution in the country. The president was clamping down on dissidents, and someone who was a relative of Aliou, a cousin who worked with the Secret Service, had called him that night and told him that if he was in the country the next morning, him and also mentioned his colleague, that if Aliou and Ibrahima, both local coordinators, both one a regional coordinator, one a local coordinator, if they were in the country by the morning, the next morning, they would both be dead. And they had to leave the country that night. And they had to escape to, so we were on the phone throughout with SFL staff, and everyone was trying to get them, smuggle them out of the Gambia. We were able to get them to Senegal, where they were for, I think, about 2 weeks. But while they were escaping, they didn't have passports with them. So it was essentially smuggling them out of the Gambia. And they spent some time in Senegal, where we were able to then facilitate their transfer from Senegal to Nigeria, where stayed with me for a couple of months till things died down, and eventually Yaya Jammeh was forced out of the country. One thing that stood up to me was the courage that these gentlemen had in the face of tyranny, in the face of death, actually. They were very adamant that they were going to continue to defend liberty with or without Students for Liberty. And SFL was there to help them. That's something I'm very proud of this organization for. And they continue to support, as alumni, continue to support our efforts in the Gambia to restore some sanity. We have a thriving community in the Gambia as a result of their efforts. But seeing young people standing up in situations like this where their safety is not guaranteed, it's very easy to keep quiet in face of situations like that and just maintain the status quo. But it's, I think it's very heroic to see people stand up. It's this problem of governments just being very oppressive is a result of years of military rulership across the continent, and it's the same in Nigeria. My experience is mostly with the police in the country. For young people in Nigeria, the police is the #1 enemy. Yep. Nigeria is a very oppressive state when it comes to police brutality. And you never can tell. You leave home in the morning and you may not make it.
And you've personally had experiences with the Nigerian police and with everything that happened with the protests against the special police squads and...
Yes, my experiences, 5, 6, 7 times I've had guns pointed at me, and I've had the police say, lie down, we're going to shoot you or kill you. One very harrowing one was when my family was in the car and they had marched us to the police station and pulled me and my wife aside and threatened to shoot if I did not pay them a certain amount of money. And they started cocking their guns and shooting in the air. And one pointed his gun at me. His name was Officer Usman. And I paid because I did not want to die. But I was able to secretly take a picture of him and made news because I essentially made sure that this was going to be the last time one of these guys would point a gun at me without me having some evidence. And while it was reported and there was some investigation opened, they do that, they closed it after a couple of weeks without any justice. But a lot of young people face the same thing. My brother had a police pull him aside and took him to somewhere in the bush, put a bag of drugs in front of him and took pictures and asked him to pay a certain amount of money. If not, he was going to be front page of the newspaper the next morning as a drug pusher. And they do this to thousands of young people across the country, which is why a couple of years ago, young people in Nigeria, young Nigerians said enough is enough and hit the streets. Thousands or hundreds of thousands of young people. And Students for Liberty was part of that protest. It was called the End SARS protest, SARS being the Special and Anti-Robbery Squad, which was the special unit within the police that was excessively brutal. And we essentially shut down the country for 5 days. It was shut down everywhere across the country because young people were tired of just waking up in the morning and just being afraid of the police. While we've not been successful fully yet, the government now knows that young people across the country have the power. If they all decide that they are going to stop something or going to see change happen, they have the power to sort of hit the streets. And tomorrow we'll be talking about activism and potentially protests as a tool for activism and how effective that could be. But the government now knows that young people, if they do decide to change things, can actually do that. And I think this is not unique to Nigeria. It's all around the world.
Yeah, so I've been in some difficult situations, and I've seen people killed, and friends of mine have been killed. And what I would say generally is, be aware of your own risk tolerance, right? So someone else says, let's go do that. Ask yourself, is that something I'm willing to do? Maybe, maybe not. But these are things you think about if you are exposed to risk. So here in Germany, it's not a particularly dangerous country. You can speak your mind and so on. And there are places like Myanmar where our friends, if they were to be discovered, would be executed. There's just no question about that. And they continue their work and only communicate on Signal, by the way, which is by far the best of the various encrypted services. And we use, when I communicate with them, the disappearing messages in case they get stopped by the police. You don't want anything on there that might link them to anti-regime activities. A couple of words of advice. If ever you're in a difficult place and you get arrested, never admit anything. It's a very important point. So when I was arrested in the Soviet Union on a couple of occasions, they would say, sign this, you did this. And I'd say, no, this is all bullshit. This isn't true. No, just sign it. I said, no. I brought in photocopying machines. They said, why are you bringing photocopying machines to the Soviet Union? And I said, I always travel with photocopying machines. I'm giving lectures at Moscow State University. How am I to make notes for the students with no photocopying machines? And these guys are like saying, oh God, what do we do? What if he has a friend? And finally, after just arguing with them, I said, of course, this is normal. Which obviously it's not normal to travel with 2 photocopying machines and 10,000 sheets of blank paper, but it was for our libertarian colleagues in Soviet Union where paper was controlled and photocopying machines were controlled. And they just finally said, just go. The other thing I learned living in Austria, save all documents that have stamps on them. This is part of the imperial mentality, Austria for sure. Because you have to have a stempel on everything before you can do anything. You need a stempel, stamp on something. So I would save all of these. And so when I was arrested in Czechoslovakia, coming in, I had a photocopying machine, 5,000 sheets of paper, and 100 photocopies of The Road to Serfdom, which is Thomas Ježek's translation, of which there were 8 copies. And doing that, I had the invitation from the head of the Prague School of Economics to deliver lectures. And I said, hier, ich habe eine offizielle Einladung und zwar mit einem roten Stempel. I have an official invitation as a red stamp. The red stamp. And so they just finally said, just go, you can go. So that's one thing. Try not to be intimidated, don't talk back, don't get in trouble, but don't admit anything if you do find yourself in an unpleasant circumstance. We have friends, also SFL members, who have been killed. So I know this is not like a recruiting point. Come join SFL. Our colleagues have been killed. None of them in Germany, none of them in Italy or France, probably Denmark. That's a scary country, but aside from that, but we're talking Syria, we're talking Afghanistan. We've had people who have been imprisoned and suffered terribly in China and other countries. And that's because they're brave, they're courageous, but they make the decisions about the risk they're willing to undertake. And that's something if you ever find yourself in a situation, think about seriously, and not just because someone else revs you up. I'll mention another person that I worked with, Karim from Egypt, and I met him at a conference years ago. He was a really quiet student, so we'd say he was neurologically a little different in the sense that he wouldn't look you in the eye when talking to you, looked at his shoes, very brave, and he was a blogger, and he got arrested for speaking the truth in Egypt. And one of the things, he was prosecuted for insulting Islam, which was not true. He had insulted the president, and that was the reason he went to prison. But he contacted me in Tbilisi on Facebook Messenger, and he's a very shy kid. He said, "Mr. Tom, how are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm fine, I'm in Tbilisi," and so on. And he said, "I've been asked to come to the prosecutor's office." And my blood got kind of cold. That's not a good thing. And I said, "Does anyone know about this?" He said, "Only you." And I said, "I'm going to call a lawyer right now. You cannot go to the prosecutor's office without a lawyer. You cannot do this. You will not walk out. They will kill you, Kareem." And so I got a lawyer to go with him, which saved his life. But he was prosecuted, he was imprisoned, he was beaten and tortured. And then finally, with colleagues in Poland and Denmark, when we got him out, I met with the president of Romania, who guaranteed him a diplomatic passport. And when he got out, we got him the fuck out of there. And went to Poland. Now he lives in Norway and is a writer. But there are dangerous, scary people in the world, and they'll hurt you for what you believe and say. So think very carefully about what you say and what you do, and be diplomatic about it. And then the last point, never go to the prosecutor's office alone. Never. If anything ever happens to you in a bad situation, make sure other people know.
Why would the lawyers going with him stop him being killed?
Had he gone, he would have just disappeared into it and he would have fallen down the stairs. You understand? It was very sad, but he fell down the stairs.
Or out of a window, as is fashionable.
Out of the window, that's another option. And having the lawyer meant there were people who were aware, and they weren't going to mess with him at that point. So they went through the legal, quote-unquote, legal process. They imprisoned him, they beat him, they tortured him, but he didn't die. So recognize, call on a network of people if ever you're in that situation. And that's what Twitter, whatever it's called now, Exeter or something, or WeChat, well, not WeChat, WhatsApp, not WeChat, because Xi Jinping will read your messages. But make sure that people know. And then also honor those people who have suffered for our cause and for the liberty of other people. And if you can, try not to be one of them.
As we're talking about him, last time we saw each other was in Prague, and you were mentioning a story when you were in Afghanistan, not that long ago, and you were meeting up with people who were starting up liberty organizations in Kabul. What is, and this is a question again for both of you, is, you know, it's relatively easy to promote the ideas that we have here in Europe. But when you are from countries that are what they are, that are unstable, that are authoritarian, where speaking about the ideas that we have is quite literally a death sentence. What is it that drives the people in our movement in those places? What do you think is sort of their emergence story? Like how are they born and how they come up to be the people they are, and to be individuals who will say, "I will die for these ideas"?
Don't be an individual who says, "I will die for these ideas." That's a mistake. I'm willing to risk death for these ideas is a different story. And there I think we can have different attitudes. And, you know, I always tell people, if they say, "Oh, I want to go with you to Eastern Ukraine," I say, you know, you have kids. Like, not a good idea. Because those kids growing up without parents, that'll be hard on them. So why don't you not do that? Instead, give me money. And I will take it and do stuff on your behalf. And you'll be with us. But I don't want your kids to grow up without mom or dad. In Afghanistan, when I went there, I was looking for people and who had these ideas, and I found the right people. And I remember having a conversation. It's a family. This is not unusual in countries like that liberty is a kind of family value. And I said to one who's a professor, a very learned person, professor of Sharia law, a liberal, and Sharia, people misunderstand what it means. It doesn't mean just cutting people's heads off. It's law. And there are scary versions of it that do involve that, but not all Sharia is about that. It's about property law and contract law and other things. And he was one of the non-scary ones. And I said, you speak Persian, Pashto, Arabic, and English. You could live someplace else. And you're a thoughtful, educated, learned person. So why do you continue to live in this difficult country? And he said, because this is our country and we don't want to be ruled by savages and murderers and barbarians. And then he left the room, and then his brother came up to me and he said, I get kind of teary when I think about it, and I remember it. He said, the Taliban killed our sister on her wedding day in her white wedding dress. We're not leaving. And that's a kind of a resolution you could imagine in that circumstance. At the final end, they did leave, and it was a very difficult experience. I worked with Linda Whetstone, who's since passed away. She was a big friend of SFL, to get them out, and finally got out a large group of them. But the other thing is, they're not stupid. You look at the places you can make incremental changes. And that meant thinking carefully about how to get people to move in our direction in a very difficult environment where people kill you when they don't think you have agreed with them on theological or other questions. And so they promoted equal rights for women. It's very controversial in that country. They had mixed gender events, but always very careful in the way that they did it. And one thing would be, as they did on radio constantly, someone would say, well, a woman shouldn't be in business. And they would say, is that your view? That it's against Islam that a woman would be in business? Well, of course, the wife of the Prophet was a businesswoman. Are you saying, perhaps, that she's not a good Muslim? Oh, for God's sake. Now that just... But they were very smart about how to do that. Because she was a businesswoman, and she was the one who supported her husband as he was preaching. So you're saying she was not a good Muslim? So they were able to, in that context, advance these principles very intelligently, very carefully. And then also they made sure all books had an imprimatur, as it was called in the Roman Catholic Church. They would get a leading imam to write a statement in the book that says, this is a most interesting book, and nothing in this book contradicts the principles of our faith. And why should it? Right? The book's about liberty, and you can have a liberal belief that's consistent with your understanding of Islam, but that allowed them to be protected from the religious police and others. So very intelligent, very careful how to do these things and to think what's the margin where we can make an incremental improvement. That case hasn't turned out well, and they've gone backward in many ways, but in other countries, this is what has moved things step by step forward. So think in a strategic way. Where can we make the incremental improvement? Where can I get someone to move in our direction? Where can I get them to rethink something? And not come along and say, wow, are you primitive and stupid? Which is not a winning line. That doesn't make you any friends. So strategy is always important. And that's, I think, something that SFL has also been good at in different contexts, in Malaysia and Indonesia, where SFL has been very active, across Africa, to take a stand for principle and then think very strategically how to advance that principle.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question that you asked. It's important to be very strategic, as Dr. Palmer said. One good example was in 2016, I think it was 18, when the president of Nigeria at the time Goodluck Jonathan was losing popularity. And he thought, look, let me look for one thing that so many Nigerians agree on. And the one thing was ban LGBTQ rights. It was not a hot topic in the country at the time. No one was asking for, equal rights. There was no request for gay marriages, nothing of the sort. But because Nigeria is a very conservative country, we have the conservative Christians in the south and the conservative Muslims in the north. He decided that he was going to find that one thing that many people, at least 96% of Nigerians at the time, supported a ban against LGBTQ rights in the country. And he made a big show out of it. So we had a conversation as Students for Liberty then, and this was many years ago. We had a smaller team in the country. We were very angry that this was, because immediately the president did that, there were a lot of attacks against people considered to be LGBTQ. People were murdered in the country for just not dressing the right way, as people thought. Yeah. And while we were very angry about the situation and we thought we needed to do something, we also realized that we were a small team at the time. We understood the dangers, and we understood that we were going to lose whatever progress we had made on other fronts if we actively engaged in doing like an offensive campaign, a pro-LGBTQ campaign. So we decided to play the long game. We decided to make sure that our regional conferences in Nigeria had at least one speaker that talked about LGBTQ ideas. And we made the regional conferences a safe space for people in the LGBT community. 3 years down the line, the regional conferences in Nigeria became a place where you could visibly see the community, LGBT community very comfortable. And we had one of the biggest advocates of LGBTQ rights in the country come out at the conference and say publicly that Students for Liberty is a home for them. The notion or the fight to have the rights of people within the LGBT community respected is like getting better by the day. There are less attacks on people within the community, and we would say that generally speaking, people are a lot more open to repelling that law right now than many years ago. So it goes to say that it's important to pick your battles. You need to be strategic about it. You need to have sometimes you have to play the long game. You do not necessarily have to repel all the laws right now. You do not necessarily have to change society right now. Just because you are passionate or you are angry about this particular situation does not mean that you put yourself in harm's way.
Thank you. I'd like to bring this sort of the topic we're going with to bring it back to Europe for a bit, considering we do have you here. And I think for the younger students in the program, I think they know you for two things. One is the Why Liberty books, and the other thing is, it's Dr. Tom Palmer, the guy who keeps going in and out of Ukraine all the time. I wanted to ask you, what is it that motivates you to keep going back? Because when you go to Ukraine, you're not staying in Lviv. You're actually going, you're meeting up with people very close to the front lines. You're in touch with people that used to be with SFL, the guys from Ukrainian Students for Freedom, and with many other partners and friends of the Liberty Movement. What is sort of your drive? What's the reason that you keep going back into Ukraine? And now it's been almost a year and a half, and constantly we're still there, and we're still trying to help.
I'm very fond of cherry vareniki, and you can only get them in Ukraine. That's one reason. They're delicious, by the way. If you go to Ukraine, order the cherry vareniki. They're spectacular. But the other thing is, so I've worked in Ukraine, I don't know, for years, and it was hard to get a liberty movement going there, so I had meetings in 2009 and 10, and no one felt much urgency about them. It's okay, we do our little thing. And similar, when I was in Taiwan, I failed to get a group going there. Now it's different. When I was in Taiwan, I gave a bunch of talks at universities and no number of professors there. And all of them said, it would be great if someone were to set up a group. You understand the problem with that? It'd be great if you did it. I'd help you maybe, but I won't do it. And if you don't have the one who says, I'll do it, it doesn't happen. Now this has changed. I wrote to people earlier this year and I said, dear friends, Ukraine is a wake-up call because you're on the menu next. Let's focus, and suddenly there's a great deal of interest, and we have now several new organizations being started, and the professors want to work with Students for Liberty. There is a small Students for Liberty presence there. It'll be much better when they have the heads of the economics departments at 5 universities as faculty sponsors. And this is going to happen. But in the Ukrainian case, I found that it's just unbearable that this was being done to our friends. It's really, I can't stand it. And when it was leading up, it was clear what was going to happen, and I was in touch with our buddies. And so you said formerly associated with SFL, they're SFL buddies. They have their own leadership structure, and they raise their own money in Ukraine, so that's a good thing. So Nova Poshta, which is the big private delivery company, very innovative, is a sponsor and so on. But they see themselves as sisters and brothers to all of you. It's not separation that way, just a structurally, legally different organization. And I've known these people, and it was just, I'm furious that this is happening, and I was stuck in COVID quarantine in Turkey. I got COVID, and had a lot of Turkish meetings, and when I got there at night, and the next morning, my friend Medeni, who was also as a friend of SFL, he was running the 3H movement, which stands for Liberty, Toleration, Rule of Law in Turkish. And he said, I'll pick you up in the morning. I said, why don't we wear masks and roll down the windows? I don't feel that hot. So I went and got a test, COVID, went into quarantine. And then the war was ramping up, and I was talking to all of my friends. And the day after the attack, we did 362 people on a Zoom call and raised, the goal was $500,000. We raised over $1 million from all the people on the Zoom call. People say, I'll send in $2,000, I'll send in $20,000, and so on. And then the day I got out of COVID, I met and he took me to a sporting goods store because I had Middle Eastern clothes. I was in Dubai before that. And Ukraine is like really cold in February and March. So I bought all these heavy boots. And I just flew to Poland. I met people who were involved in Polish SFL. And I said, I want to buy a car. So I bought a car, a 2006 Dodge van, and loaded it up with stuff and just drove to Ukraine and then brought out refugees, and I did that. And it was very weird because after I'd been doing that just every single day, I think 10 weeks, and someone asked me, he said, how long have you been doing this? I said, I don't know, 2.5 weeks or something. And I looked on the calendar, it had been 10 weeks. And that, it's just weird. I didn't think about time. Because just always driving and delivering and then going and picking up supplies and buying stuff and taking it to people and so on. But I find it unbearable. Now, I also have a little bit of an advantage. I learned a long time ago, I'm just not afraid of other people. So but it's not a special skill, that's me. So it's like some people can sing really well. I bet you sing really well. I cannot sing, right? I know that. But another feature of me is I'm just not afraid of other people. Fuck them. Pardon my French again. Just fuck them. What are they going to do? So they kill you. What do they do after that? Right? So it doesn't bother me. I have a different risk attitude, and I don't have any children. And I think that would change my mind, right, if you thought about that. So that's about being different people. But the other thing is, I don't abandon my friends. And that's just like a fixed point. I will not abandon my friends. So if anything were to happen to you, Stefan, the Serbian government did some crappy thing, your friends would be there for you. And I think that's something you know is true. And that's very important for our movement. We don't abandon our friends. In my case, I was going to do things some other people won't do, but the core principle is something we all have in common. We don't abandon our friends. And to me, that's just the rock bottom principle. And I can do things other people won't do. And I've known people who've been killed in this process. I had talked to a Russian guy who's helping the Ukrainians, and he's not as educated. He's a real, in his heart, libertarian, but he's not as college educated like this group is. And he told me, he said, I know, Tom, Russian army catch me, I not die slow, I not die fast. That's quite clear. So his English is a little rusty, but the meaning was quite clear. He says, I know I not die fast, but he is going to do it. He finds this intolerable. And he said he couldn't just sit and watch television and consume Russian propaganda and watch this happen in front of him. And in various degrees, I know that's what is in the heart of everybody here. We just can't stand just watching other people being oppressed. We have to do something about it.
You mentioned you lost track of time when the war started. I think that was true for a lot of us. Those first few months were very, very hectic, and everything seemed to have slowed down. We were all sort of in Ukraine, I think mentally for a bit. Mayo, I wanted to bring it back to you, considering we're talking about what's happening in Ukraine now, and we were talking about Russia, and we were talking about the situation in Nigeria and Afghanistan across the world. As both sort of veterans of the liberty movement, I mean, Dr. Palmer just said he was arrested in the Soviet Union. That was quite a bit of time ago. Where do you see the future for the liberty movement, in a sense? Are we winning the internal battle? Are you hopeful for what comes next?
Well, I think that generally speaking, we can say that the world is getting better. Well, if you asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I was very, very optimistic. I think generally that things are getting better. But the last 2-3 years, makes me worry a little bit. It was almost like, for someone watching Europe from outside of Europe, it was unspeakable that you'd have a war going on in Europe and a country would, sort of invade another and start killing essentially their neighbors. It was, like the things like that, you say, oh, it's, wars happen in Africa. You don't expect that you'd have a situation like this in Europe. But that's the case, and that's what we are dealing with right now. Unfortunately, the last 12 months have sort of, there's a lot of warmongering going on in parts of the world right now. My home country, Nigeria, is presently, preparing to invade our neighbor, the Niger Republic. And, just seeing this and seeing people beating the drums of war and talking about, going to another person's, land and kill them. And people, supporting that just makes me a little bit worried that the progress that I think that the world has made with respect to promoting liberty we seem to be taking steps back. Which is why I believe, and I was telling the African coordinators this at their TLR 3 weeks ago, which is why I think that we as young people need to be alert and we need to fight tyranny however we can. Right now, a lot of young Africans are becoming pro-Russia, like the propaganda is getting to them. And while Russia is not just spending a lot of money ramping up propaganda in Russia for Russians, it's spending a lot of money spewing propaganda in Africa. There is a movie that was released recently. It's called The Tourist, and it depicts Russia, a Russian militia, going to save the people of Congo. It paints the UN as as imbeciles, and France and England and the United States as colonialists, and it was paid for by the Wagner Group, right? So you see that the propaganda it's not just in Russia, it's also in Africa. A couple of hours ago, I was reading a list of, reading an article that had a list of individuals on the continent of Africa and media groups that are on the payroll of Russia. And these are many people with hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers who every day are spewing pro-Russia narrative, and they are paid, right? When you go to many online forums and you see how a lot of young people are praising Putin, it's scary, right? So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do. Because if we let this happen, or if we let this narrative is not countered, not only in Africa, but around the world, it's going to be problematic, right? The young people who are consuming this propaganda right now and are becoming a lot more pro-Putin would be the ministers and the bureaucrats and the presidents in the next 2 decades, next 1 to 2 decades. And that's very dangerous. So we're in a battle of ideas, and we have the right ideas, and I think we need to do a lot more work to counter this dangerous narrative that seems to be spreading like wildfire.
I'd like to add a few thoughts. One thing that occurred to me, actually I looked it up on my phone, the name of the Nobel Prize winner from China, Liu Xiaobo. So family name Liu, you could Google his family name and Nobel Prize and read his Nobel speech, which he was not allowed to deliver. It's extremely powerful and moving, and I think a good template for how to advance liberalism. The other thing, Hayek, remember he dedicated The Road to Serfdom. He didn't say, in order to defeat all the moronic socialist clowns, he dedicated it to socialists of all parties. And it's a very open-minded appeal. He said, we share the same goals, but I think you've made an intellectual mistake, and here's my case. And it changed the minds of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of key people. And that book was one of the turning points of the 20th century, in my opinion. But I'd like to mention, then follow up on this, the world's going to continue getting a little bit richer because of the momentum of good policy reforms that happen. That's a good thing. But I do think intellectually we are on the back foot, as they say. In some ways we're losing the arguments. There are explicitly anti-liberal movements in the world, and they have their champions, their intellectuals, and they have a lot of resources. I don't want to say it's just all money, but money from the Chinese government, money from the Iranian government, money from the Russian government, and their allies in Germany and the US and elsewhere. They're extremely well funded. I am shocked, I'm still shocked, that ideas we thought had died in 1945 are back. Real National Socialism. It's back. When you look at what's coming out of the Kremlin, it just tracks the whole Third Reich ideology. The Volksgenossen, our ethnic comrades, we're saving them. Everything tracks. It's just really weird and uncanny. All the books are back. All the ideas, now they're labeled alt-right and national conservatism and various other names, but it's the package that I thought I would never see in my lifetime. And here it is, with all of the ugly racial collectivism and the anti-Semitism and all of that. And sometimes they hide it. Gay bashing is easier in many places than Jew bashing, but get a couple drinks in them and the Jew bashing comes out too. So this is that agenda, and we have to defeat it. We have to think very carefully, how can we undermine these arguments? How can we engage with people who find them attractive? And how do we rebut them and show them the benefits of liberalism? It isn't as stirring in the blood as massacring your neighbors. You know, not many people, things get, especially young men, as exciting as going and killing your neighbors. So it isn't stirring in that way, but there's something noble and beautiful about the liberal vision, and we need to be able to convey that. So intellectually, I just want to be very blunt, we're losing, right? But that doesn't mean we've lost, and it doesn't mean it's inevitable that we will keep on losing. We have to respond to them and show why open, liberal societies are better, why they offer better lives on the policy front and also on the kind of spiritual level of what it is that should move us. Here's some good news, though. I think I can say, looking back over 50 years, the liberal movement globally has never been as well prepared as we are today. SFL is a really important part of this. And that's one of the reasons I'm so proud of SFL. I'm so happy. By the way, I give money to SFL every month. It disappears out of my bank account. It goes to SFL's accounts, and I'm happy about that. I feel proud of that because I know it's going to something good and valuable. And I tell all the other people I work with, I say, you should be giving money every month to SFL or putting them in your will or whatever. This is a good cause.
Kenny has a smiling face.
He's the guy.
He's thinking, if I only had 1,000 more of you.
So we're better prepared, but the challenge is real. And if we do not rise to it, the outcome will be very, very grim. A world of collectivism, of constant war, of persecution, and what comes with that is declining incomes, poverty that gets blamed on liberalism, so that you repeat the cycle, and the world will start to swirl around the drain if we are not able to meet that challenge. So the last thing I want to mention in that context is it's a moral challenge, it's a political challenge, it's an intellectual challenge. That means get to know the arguments from the other side. Listen to them. Try to understand them. What is it that moves people to be attracted to that? Don't only read the books that you agree with. Right? Don't only read things by people whose ideas you already like. Read far left, far right, center, this, that, the other thing. Know those arguments and actually know them better than the people who follow them, so that you can respond and you can engage with them and help them to see the world in a different way. It's a long-term agenda that will take decades, but that, I think, is an important part of how we're going to succeed in promoting a world that is freer, more peaceful, more just, and more prosperous.
I think what you're trying to say is history, in fact, did not end. It's still ongoing, and as you said, there's now politics that are coming back that we thought that our grandfathers fought and died for some 80 years ago, and it's back now. Communism still hasn't gone away. I mean, China's as strong as ever, and we thought that in '89 when the wall fell, communism fell with it, but the problems still persist. Thank you very much. I'd like to see now if the students have any questions before I turn it sort of to Mayowa for a final a closing statement. But if anybody has any questions for the speakers, yes. Duarte first, and then David.
Well, the question was for Tom specifically, because regarding the United States. A good friend of mine is going to a conference in the United States, NTC, the Conservative Conference, I don't remember the name, it's in July. And he's been going for some years, and he's saying that he's discovering a trend right now in some circles in the United States, which which is young people especially are adopting a theory. It's called integralism, proposed by Harvard professor. And it's saying that it's noticing this trend that more and more of these conservative think tanks, more and more young people specifically, are going for this theory. It's considered a post-liberal theory, if you call it that. And I wanted to ask Tom if you think that not only this series specifically about terrorism, but I think it's one of the most, the one that has the best arguments out of those post-liberal theories. And I want to know if you think it's a real threat or it's going to fade away.
I think it is a real threat. So I've been reading a fair amount of this literature. I haven't read Vermeulen's stuff yet, but I will get to it. Books on post-liberalism. One thing is, it's unclear what they're offering as an alternative. They have a big critique of liberalism, and they understand liberalism roughly as we do, and they hate it. They think it leads to anomie, it leads to pointlessness in life, and so on. And then they blame everything on it, global warming and bad breath and whatever, anything bad, it's all liberalism's fault. It's not clear that they have a very coherent response. And Vermeulen, who's a Catholic integralist, somehow lives under the fantasy view, and this Ahmad Sorabi, the other one, who's also a recent convert to Catholicism, that somehow the Roman Catholic faith is going to become the state religion of America. Well, seriously, this is not going to happen. Go explain that in some small southern town where they're all Southern Baptists. So this is not happening. It's a fantasy world that they live in, ultimately. But they do attack liberalism. They are all of them pro-Kremlin, just all the way down the line, because they believe that Russia is a country defending traditional Christian values. Well, it's like they've never been to Russia, right? Unbelievably high out-of-wedlock birth. I mean, if you go down what you would call traditional conservative Christian values, that is not Russia at all. This is bizarre. But they believe it. They consume all of this Kremlin propaganda, and some of them have close Kremlin ties, and Orban as well. And by the way, I'll mention one quick thing as an aside. The MCC, the new think tank established by the Hungarian government to promote these alt-right neo-fascist values, they only have 1.2 billion euros as a gift from the taxpayers of, frankly, Denmark and Germany, who subsidize Hungary. It has such a high subsidy rate from the European Union, and this is what they're putting it into, is poison. They're spewing out poison, and with their classes and courses, basically immersing people in what really has to be called neo-fascism. This is really what they're promoting. And with a lot of resources. So yes, I think we need to respond to these things and take them seriously and respond in a serious way. What is the alternative that you're proposing? Why we think that the criticism of liberalism is off base? And if what they're saying, which is what they are saying, liberalism isn't perfect. The world under liberalism isn't perfect. So let's get rid of liberalism. That's essentially what they're arguing. This is a joke. Is this not something adults should be thinking? That if you find some institution is a little bit flawed, we'll just get rid of it and have some other thing that didn't turn out really well in 1945, by the way. So we need to engage them and respond to them, read their books. And I'll mention one of the best books to read, if you want to read a very powerful attack on liberalism, is Carl Schmitt, The Concept of the Political. It's a short book that's also advantageous, especially for a German. So it's not like a 700-page tome that says one thing. It's a short book. It's very rich. He engages with liberal thinkers like Franz Oppenheimer, Josef Schumpeter, and others. And on every issue, he takes the anti-liberal position, intelligently. And this book is extremely influential. Whenever you cut open texts of the far right or the far left, you can find at the core Carl Schmitt. And whether they're hardcore leftists like Antonio Negri, or hardcore right-wingers like Alexander Dugin and all these Alain de Benoist and others in Europe, it's Carl Schmitt. So engage with that. I encourage you to read the book and try to wrestle with the arguments that he offers. And then the other one, who's now becoming more, what's the word?
Influential?
No, when the cover is taken off. Exposed. He's becoming more exposed. This is Martin Heidegger. Again, far left and far right. Heidegger attack on the inauthenticity of liberal society. And there's a very good new book by Richard Wolin called Heidegger in Ruins. It's a really very powerful attack that points out Heidegger was a National Socialist, not the sophisticated philosopher that he's portrayed himself as. This is well worth reading, in my opinion, to engage with these creepy figures. But yes, engage with them, read them. Vermeulen I haven't read yet, but I intend to. I have to build up sufficient reservoir of masochism to read his books. But I think that we should do that. And so a good one to start with is just Carl Schmitt, The Concept of the Political.
David.
Oh. Sometime.
No.
Maybe you want to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh.
No? Okay, go ahead.
Hi again, David, and there's a question which is bothering me for a long time. I want to know the reasons which is leading us to defeat in this intellectual war with others, basically. What are the reasons and what are the problems we have? Because I think it's the most interesting part. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'll answer a little bit and then have Tom also take that. The people and organizations and movements that promote illiberal ideas are not silent. They are well organized. They're well funded, and whether it's governments in Europe, there is a lot of funding that goes to organizations and individuals that are promoting illiberal ideas. And they are very, very well connected. And if that continues, which I don't think we are likely to see a decline in that, it means that we as young people, as Students for Liberty, or as the liberal movement, as it is, or the pro-liberty movement, need to be able to counter this narrative. We need to have sophisticated arguments and know exactly what's going on the other side. It's not enough for us to be in echo chambers where we are just agreeing with one another and just saying the same things over and over. We need to be aware of the enemies of these ideas and what they are up to. On the continent of Africa, which I'm very familiar with because I spent most of my life there, they are right now across the continent, they're organizing, right? Right now we have a series of military coups that have happened across the continent, especially in the Sahel region. And if you speak to the average young Nigerian or young Ghanaian now about what their position is with respect to living under military dictatorships, you'd find that they are favorable. They believe that we should move from democracy to authoritarian regimes. And why is that? It's because in the media, every now and then, there are arguments for why the democracy that we practice right now isn't suitable for us as Africans. And we should experiment with military dictatorships, or with the strong man, the benevolent dictator, like we did not do that for 20 years. right? So those who promote the ideas of collectivism are very organized and they are well funded, and therefore we have to stand up against those very dangerous values.
Also, they like following orders. So I think that helps with the with the organizing.
This is a really hard problem, and of course, the two versions of the same question in a way that have been posed. And I've thought about this, and I addressed it, so you can find online, an article at Reason magazine that I published a couple of years ago, The Terrifying Rise of Authoritarian Populism. So you can find it online, reason.com, Tom Palmer, and you'll come to their website. And I read a tremendous amount of really terrible literature for this. You should be grateful to me for having done this. Ernesto Laclau, who's a completely unreadable post-Marxist, neo-fascist writer, wrote a book on populist reason. And it's all Schmittian, by the way. This is very important. There's politically, so there's the intellectual element. I have a paper I could share with you that I delivered at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting. I read a lot of literature on what was called the Conservative Revolution in Germany, which preceded National Socialism and really tilled the ground for it. Not all of the conservative revolutionaries became Nazis, but many did. Some of them were executed because they said, well, we meant a totalitarian dictator, but not that one. So this is the problem with totalitarianism. But they tilled the ground, and so I read a lot of this really horrifying literature from the 20s and the 30s. Some of it I felt like I had been swimming in a sewer afterwards. So if you're interested, write to me. I'll send you a copy of the paper. I translated all of the German into English for you. So those ideas are back, and one of the issues is that liberalism doesn't seem exciting. It doesn't stir the blood like hating other people does. Hating other people will move you, and tolerating them just somehow is not as exciting. So that's part of the problem. And Hayek addressed this, by the way, in his Intellectuals and Socialism. We need liberalism to be an exciting intellectual project. Doesn't mean we know all the answers. Part of his response, by the way, was he said liberalism had become a dogma. Oh, we know the answer to all these questions. It wasn't something that would engage people who wanted to think through hard problems. It needs to be a living tradition, which means not being dogmatic, listening to other people, thinking about hard problems, engaging with them. That's how you keep a movement alive. But we need to have something about liberalism that makes it exciting. Now, part of the lack of excitement of liberalism is we haven't developed a good sense of what is a liberal identity. Young people especially want identities. Right? That's why kids join gangs. That's why at school there's the kids who dress this way and the goths and so on. Because part of being a social primate is finding who you are, and part of that means being a member of this group or that group, having some identity. And I think that a liberal identity is important, which is to say we believe in, we stand for a free society. The left has pioneered in recent years identity politics, and now it has called forth a monster from the deep, which is right-wing identity politics. This, I think, is part of what's happened. We heard from all of the Marxists and post-Marxists and so on, identity. So, I'm sorry, you can't understand what I'm saying because I'm black, I'm transgender, I'm this, that, or the other thing. That's polylogistic idea. And I've got this identity that somehow puts me against you. And when you do that, it turns out other people say, well, you know, we have an identity too. And there are a lot of us. And I think this has driven these recent white supremacist movements in Europe and America and elsewhere, because they say, well, we have an identity, so why not? And that's scary. Well, we need a liberal identity. That's hard to do. So let's take the case of Ukraine, what our Ukrainian friends are doing. You could say, oh, the Russians are trying to conquer us, so here's our response. Russians are filthy monsters, we're Ukrainians, and we're better. Our language, our cherry Vareniki, right, which is true, it's fabulous. Everything about us is better than those monsters. Well, that just plays their game. You just become like them. Instead, to develop an identity that to be Ukrainian is to be a free person. And you can speak Russian, you can speak Ukrainian, you can speak Hungarian, you can speak Romanian or Polish or anything, right? Do what you want. You can go to Orthodox Church, you can go to synagogue, you can go to mosque, whatever you want. That's the identity that our colleagues in Ukraine want to promote, to stand against this Russian identity of nationalism, monism, hatred, and so on. So how do we develop a liberal identity that can be attractive and motivating and inspiring for people, that isn't one of the exclusive identities that says, I'm white, I'm black, I'm German, I'm Italian, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, whatever it is, and you're not. We want an identity that is willing to live with others. And if we can't develop that, I think we are at a huge disadvantage. And the last point, there's a myth that's been propagated for decades. National Socialism, Fascism, these are movements old people push these on young people. This is bullshit. They were youth movements. And everybody at the time knew it. And in Germany, it was old people who said, my God, what is happening to our country? And young people who flocked to the swastika. They loved it. An identity, purpose in life. You know, wir sind zum Sterben für Deutschland geboren. We are born to die for Germany. This is not attractive to 80-year-olds. It is very attractive to 15 to 20-year-olds. And young people are attracted to identities. We need an alternative identity that would be attractive. And I'm not sure how to do it, but a liberal identity that doesn't fall into the trap of all the collectivist identities. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what we need to do if we're going to win against these people.
Okay, thank you very much. Every time we organize one of these retreats or something like Liberty Column, we know a session is going to go over time. I'm just happy that for this TLR, this was the session that went over time. I think it was very worth having this conversation. I think this is sort of the first time we've ever done this sort of format and had a philosophical debate at a top leadership retreat. So thank you very much to both of you. For the rest of you, if you do have any more questions, we will all be here for at least for tonight, and you'll get to ask more questions for both Dr. Palmer and to Olumayowa.
Last point.
Yes.
This informality is a little grating, Dr. Palmer. Herr Professor Dr. von und zu Palmer. Either that or Tom.
Tom.
Because in this group, I prefer to be considered a comrade and not Dr. Palmer. Is that okay? So
Thank you
I'm
very
just
much,
Tom.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the great session. Olumayowa, you as well. Thank you very much.